Well, hello everybody, Max of Pilots and Prop Wash here, and given the incredible response I had to my When General Aviation Was Affordable video, I decided to go ahead and extemporate a little bit, especially given all the wonderful comments that were left behind, many of which were very educational, even for someone who's been in aviation as long as I have. One of the overarching themes of a lot of the comments was that aviation's never been cheap, it's always been expensive, and it really isn't that much more expensive than it used to be, adjusted for inflation. But I'm going to put up a counter argument to that. I went ahead and took the time to start crunching the numbers based, of course, on averages using some mainline aircraft, and particularly the Cessna 172. Since it is still both popular as a rental and training aircraft, it's still in large use. And then we're going to look at other airplanes like the SR-22. Now, a lot of folks had also mentioned that airplanes today are a lot more than the rudimentary aircraft of 50 years ago, and there's certainly an element of truth in that. No one is going to compare the operating cost of a Piper Tri-Pacer or an Aeronca to an SR-22. But I think it's important to point out that even with the changes in technology, there have still been a lot of disproportionate increases in cost. Now, we all know that insurance has been a major driving factor in general aviation costs for a long time. There's nothing new about that. It is higher than it used to be, even adjusted for inflation, but then that's also because a lot of the aircraft are much more expensive, even adjusted for inflation. In fact, let's just go ahead and jump into a couple of numbers. I used a dollar over time converter to figure this out and average numbers. And of course, before I get started, we can see that a lot of modern aircraft have a lot of equipment and capabilities that did not exist in the older aircraft. I know I sometimes repeat myself, but I feel like I need to drive these points home sometimes just because they wind up popping up in the comment section, even though I mentioned them a couple of times. And also, this is not scripted. This is more of a stream of consciousness thing. This is a conversation, not a class. So if I do repeat myself, please forgive me, especially if I repeat myself. Yes, that was a joke. A couple of things I'll acknowledge right now. Yes, generally speaking, aircraft are safer than they used to be, and they are more complicated machines. The very rudimentary aircraft, as much as we love them, such as I learned to fly in and spent a good chunk of my career in, were much simpler and easier to produce. Now, with that being said, though, let's start looking at a couple of the comparisons. In 1960, a brand new Cessna 172 ran a little over $9,000. I used $10,000 to include taxes, delivery, all those sorts of things. Just I wanted to round up and keep the math simple. So let's go with $10,000, put you in a brand new Cessna 172. Adjusted for inflation, that airplane should cost about $104,000. However, we must acknowledge that a modern Cessna 172 has a lot of stuff in it that simply did not exist in the original airplane. It's more comfortable, it's bigger, it takes more aluminum, has more advanced electronics, a more reliable engine. But the cost starts at over 4 times the adjusted cost for inflation. And that's the starting cost. Of course, both of these would be baseline airplanes, so that's fair. Of course, product liability insurance is part of the equation, but I think the bigger one is the lack of economy of scale, because there are still a lot of 1960s Cessna 172s flying around. And just because you can afford a $400,000 airplane doesn't mean you want to spend $400,000 on one. There are a lot of really nice Cessna 172s out there for under $100,000. This, I believe, is the primary competition for and main price driver of the new aircraft. And by the way, when the statement of repose went into effect and Cessna started making airplanes again, the price of used airplanes skyrocketed. When they saw what Cessna wanted for a new airplane, everybody figured their used airplanes were undervalued, and judging by the fact that they're still able to sell them, they were right. Now, a 4 times jump in price is not driven by insurance, nor government regulation. That is strictly a supply and demand thing. According to GAMA, the General Aviation Manufacturers Association, more aircraft were sold in 1978 than any other year since World War II except for 1946, which did see a very brief boom. Let's go ahead and start looking at what happens after World War II. In 1947, just under 16,000 units are sold, and then it drops to below 10,000 and then below 4,000 up until the 50s. Then it starts picking up again. I'm guessing most likely a lot of the old World War II surplus airplanes have been taken out of service. By the late 1960s, unit sales are back up to over 10,000 a year, and it peaks in 1978 at 17,811 aircraft. But then it starts a fairly rapid decline, and by 1981, we're down to less than 10,000 a year again. By 1987, only 1,085 units are delivered. Nowadays, it's measured in the hundreds. Quite frankly, I do not believe there are a lot of reasons for this. I believe the reasons are pretty simple. The market is saturated. Less people are learning to fly because the cost has gone up, even adjusted for inflation, by over 20% on average. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but flying was never cheap. You add 20% onto an already expensive endeavor, and that is all it takes to push a lot of people out of the market. And to be quite candid, I don't know how much truth there is in the claim that we have a declining middle class in the United States, but it would tend to support that idea that real wages are lower and the cost of things is climbing. And when you're dealing with something like aviation, it doesn't take a long stretch to open the gap beyond a lot of people's reach. This, of course, is just my 30,000-foot view of things. I don't have any hard specs on that. It's really hard to get those numbers nailed down. Trust me, I looked. Half of what you read is more political in nature than it is economic. Although I do get a pretty strong sense that the value of wages earned in this country is diminished and the cost of aviation has gone up, and I would guesstimate roughly 20% in each direction. That makes a really wide gap. At least this is what I've been able to ferret out. Now, once again, and I know I repeat myself, you can't really compare the very simple airplanes of yesteryear to the modern whiz-bang stuff we have today. That absolutely explains a chunk of the increase in cost. The performance of these new airplanes is incredible. But a new Cirrus can run $1.2 million fully decked out. You can't touch one for much below $800,000, and that's before the taxes. Of course, there were no fixed-gear airplanes that were moving at those kinds of speeds with those kinds of capabilities 50 years ago. So it's not an entirely fair comparison, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that this kind of gap in prices is not inflation. A high cost of manufacture is a big part of the equation. Advanced technology and research and engineering that all has to be compensated for explains a good deal of the extraordinary expense you pay today. But of course, the real boogeyman out there is all of these costs have to be spread out over so few examples. When you don't have an economy of scale, you are going to get a very high per unit cost. That being said, even if they were making 5,000 airplanes a year, I'm still pretty sure these things would be very expensive. Let me throw another example out here. In 1961, Cessna introduced its 320 Skynight, basically just a turbocharged 310 with a few bells and whistles. It sold around $60,000 in 1961. More or less about the same price as a Baron, the aircraft which it was designed to compete with. Adjusted for inflation, the airplane should run probably $250,000 today, maybe $300,000. Yet, the Baron, the only light twin of its class still in production, will set you back $1.5 million for a new one, which really isn't that bitter a pill to swallow. We consider some folks are spending almost that much on a Cirrus with only one engine. So I guess I shouldn't be too shocked, or perhaps we've just all gotten comfortably numb with these numbers. However, going to the back end of the spectrum, you can still find the $20,000 or $30,000 bug smash and puddle jumper that a lot of us learn to fly in, with the most basic instruments, sometimes not even a radio. They're still a lot of fun, and some of them even make halfway decent traveling machines. If you want to get into a tail dragger, you might even save a little more money. Since so few people can fly them, there's actually less demand for them. That's kind of sad. I learned in the very tail dragger you see right here. That's my dad standing in front of his airplane, the very Luscombe that I learned to fly in. Now, one thing I should point out is that, as I recall, back in the day, not a lot of the guys in the airport actually insured their aircraft. And there's no law that requires it today. You pick yourself up a nice little Tri-Pacer or Aeronica Champ, don't want to insure it, pay cash, that's on you. With the STCs for Autogas, if you want to put in a little effort, you can get the cost of General Aviation down, maybe not quite what it used to be. Tie downs and hanger rents have gotten out of sight along with everything else, but it's all in how you want to play the game, what your wallet will afford, and what risk you feel like taking. Unfortunately, increasing regulation has closed off a lot of airspace to airplanes that don't have all kinds of expensive equipment. Yeah, you can drive the price back down, and no, it never was cheap. But proportionally, it is, even adjusted for inflation, more expensive than it used to be. And you can blame all of the boogeymen we've already talked about. Lack of an economy of scale, not enough pilots, expensive fuel, expensive insurance, expensive component costs, increased regulation, a certain apathy towards aviation in the general writ large. I mean, there was a time when aviation was exciting. Every young kid dreamed of having a hot rod and flying the X-15. Pilots were always coming back with incredible stories of daring do, and you felt like Eddie Rickenbacker every time you climbed into the cockpit of your little 85 horsepower tail dragger. No, they were great days. I wouldn't trade them for anything. And there's some of that magic still out there. You got to work a little harder to get to it, but it's there if you want it. Don't let anything hold you back. I'm Max of Pilots and Prop Wash. Guys, thanks for the incredible response, all the great comments, and tell me what you think. Take care of yourselves, and as always, blue skies and tailwinds.